From Melbourne in Australia, the latest from podnews.net. The CEO of Pocket Casts, Owen Grover, spoke at AusPod 2019 today. It's an Australian podcast conference, and in a wide-ranging Q&A with ABC Audio Studios boss Kelly Reardon, Grover predicted a continuing decrease in Apple's influence and said that Pocket Casts is planning for a future where there's no market leader in podcast discovery. He warned us to be careful of Spotify. He says Spotify are helping non-podcast listeners to discover content, but we're fooling ourselves if we believe they'll definitely do this for the love of the medium. And asked whether Pocket Casts will share individual audience listener data in future, no, he said, adding, "We won't do that. Is that clear enough? No." I think it's clear enough to me. As of Friday the 27th of December, there were 741,600 podcasts in Apple Podcasts, says Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast. And that number started a presentation from me, James Cridland, Pod News' editor, highlighting the benefit of RSS for a level playing field and looking at Australian and global podcast data. You'll find my slides in the show notes and in our newsletter today. And the ABC Podcast Survey 2019, released to coincide with AusPod 2019, reveals just how engaged podcast audiences are. Their data also highlights that growth in podcast listeners in Australia has been driven from regional and rural areas, and that word of mouth remains the most popular way of discovering new podcasts. The full survey results are linked to from our show notes and our newsletter today. In other news, the third annual Discover Pods conference are open for nominations. General Motors is to bring Amazon Alexa to millions of cars next year. Spotify is testing the ability to report podcast episodes and songs. Reasons given include hate speech, violent or gory content, or I just don't like it. And Headliner's automatic video generation tool now works on mobile phones. And in podcasts today, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend returns next week with comedy heavy hitters such as Ellen DeGeneres, David Letterman and Tina Fey. The podcast has achieved over 55 million downloads so far and 23,000 ratings and reviews. And that's the latest from our newsletter at podnews.net.